At the age of 6, a young boy travels through particularly dangerous trenches to deliver bullets to soldiers on the front line. He was on a mission under fire, and could have been killed if he hadn't been careful. His name is Sergei. A few days ago he was sleeping at home. His mother came into the room, picked him up and threw him out of the window. She told him to run, and not to look back. And then she was shot dead by the enemy. The whole village burned with the fire of war. Sergei was the only one who escaped. Sergei cried out for his mother as he fled into the forest.
Мама, мама, где я? Где ты, мама? Мама.
He knew that from this moment on he would never have a mother again. The next morning Sergei was drinking water by the river when some German soldiers came to search the woods. He panicked and hid in a hole in a tree. He covered his mouth with his little hand, not daring to make a sound, even if a poisonous snake crawled past him. He held back his fear and didn't dare to move. He knew that the Germans in front of him were more dangerous than the snakes. Soon the 3 Germans had eaten their fill and left, but their leftovers were the only food Sergei had for days. After that Sergei wandered through the woods. When his shoes broke, he wrapped them in tree bark and kept walking. When he was hungry, he ate wild fruits from the trees, and when he was thirsty, he drank rainwater. When it was dark, he picked up branches and used them as weapons.
Не подходи. У меня ружье. Тебя не боюсь. Я тебя не боюсь.
But Sergei's little body couldn't hold out any longer. He lay weakly on the ground and a hedgehog crawled up to him. Sergei said helplessly,
Чего смотришь, колючка наедая? Узбек сказал наша.
and with that he passed out. Some time later a Soviet scout found him and brought him back to the barracks. Everyone saw the wounded little man. They all gathered around. The commander, who was always serious, was amused by the little guy. When the commander asked for his name, Sergei stood up and shook his hand and answered politely. But when he was asked about his mother and father, the strong little man burst into tears.
Тетка Анисия сказала, что мама.
Seeing this child who had lost everything before him, the soldiers were heartbroken, and they all held him tenderly in their arms to comfort him. The next day he was taken to the field hospital. The beautiful, gentle nurses took care of him. The officer came to visit him often. He gave Sergei a clip from his gun to play with. Sergei's presence brought joy to the hospital, which was full of sickness and pain. Soldiers often brought him gifts. Sergei became the darling of the group. He warmed the hearts of all those who had been battered by the war. The nurses begged the officer to keep the child in the barracks, but he was adamantly opposed, because children don't belong on the battlefield. The nurse was stunned.
Здесь никому не место.
A few days later Sergei recovered. He was to be sent to an orphanage. The officer was filled with sadness, but there was nothing he could do. He gave Sergei a small wooden gun. Sergei threw his arms around him. It was these 2 words that changed the officer's mind. He decided to keep Sergei and take him in as his adopted son. When he found out that Sergei had been retained, the soldiers were overjoyed. An old tailor worked through the night to make him a new uniform. In his uniform, a brave soldier was born. To be a good soldier, first you have to get dressed before this match burns out. 6-year-old Sergei demanded the same thing, but apparently the officer let him off the hook. With his uniform on, Sergei is now officially a soldier. He was running around the barracks with a lot of energy. Suddenly, enemy planes bombed the camp. Sergei was frozen in place and didn't know what to do, but the officer spotted him just in time. He was thrown into the trench. Sergei finally realized the horrors of war. He saw wounded soldiers trying to help, but no one needed the help of a child. So he went into the tent. He grabbed a small glass of water. He gave each wounded soldier a drink of water. It was the only thing he could do. One soldier was blind. He took out a letter from his family and asked Sergei to read it to him. But Sergei couldn't read. He could only read them out in his imagination.
Пишут вам, что вас очень любят. Корова ваша здорова. И молока много дает.
Погоди, дружок, корова? Какая корова?
Ну, ваша. Такая. Ну, это, красивая.
Ты что ж, Егорыч, радоваться надо. Корова здорова. Серега, читай дальше.
Ну, читай.
Вот.
The soldiers laughed as they listened. The childish voice made every soldier weep. Sergei told his father that he wanted to thank the tailor, who had made his uniform, but his father took him to a ruin. There was a crater with a sewing machine that had been blown up. At that moment he realized that the tailor had been killed. He took off his hat in tribute to the tailor, just as his father had done. The next day, Sergei came to his father's command. He volunteered to become a communications officer. Sergei ran through the trenches to bring letters home to the soldiers, and so Sergei became even more popular with everyone. But once in a while, a letter wouldn't get through. Sergei would slowly take off his hat to pay his respects. Sometimes Sergei would do the same as the scouts, looking around with binoculars, and he does find a moving foot in the grass. He rushed back to the camp and reported the situation to the lieutenant. With Sergei leading the way, they found two enemies without any problems. So as not to alert the enemy, they quietly set fire to the haystack. Soon two enemy soldiers escaped. They were subdued on the spot, and Sergei dragged a radio out of the haystack. He was able to intercept the information that the enemy was about to send. Sergei had done a great service, and received a compliment from his father. And soon after, Sergei saw for himself how cruel war can be. Little boy hauling a heavy box of bullets through the trenches of war to deliver supplies to the soldiers on the front line. The old soldier tells him to get to safety, but Sergei insisted on being a good soldier. The old soldier had no choice but to tell Sergei, the first thing a qualified soldier must do is follow orders. Sergei had to turn around and go back to the camp when he heard that the telephone line to the command post had been blown. So he ran his little hand along the telephone line. He had the audacity to crawl out of the trench. He crawled through the smoke-filled battlefield. He soon found the communicator. He saw the communicator, who had only his last breath. He told Sergei how to connect the telephone line. Sergei was able to restore communications, and they were able to win the battle. They were soon on their way to a new battlefield. At that moment a truck in the rear hit a mine. Sergei was knocked unconscious by the blast. A soldier died right next to him. Even Dad was wounded. War is cruel. The road was tough. They finally rejoined the group. Sergei still went to see his father to get his assignment. Dad told him to check his uniform and equipment. Sergei received his orders. And immediately ran off happily. But everyone thought he was playing around and offered him chocolate. Although Sergei wanted to eat it, he resisted. The company commander saw how serious he looked, so he had the soldiers form up. The young soldier, who was only 6 years old, was examined. Sergei couldn't write, so he asked the company commander to write it down for him. Back in the command room, Sergei submitted his mission record. The general was very impressed with him. His father's face was full of pride. At night, he and his father took a walk together. Sergei jumped into the trench, but his father was pinned under a heavy object. Sergei rushed forward and tried to remove the wood to save his father, but even with all his strength, he could not help. In desperation, he went to get help. It was dawn and the chief was saved in time. Sergei looked at his father in his bed and wept. The war ended soon afterwards. Sergei returned home with his troops. Although Sergei was only 6 years old, he had already become a real soldier. He was awarded a Medal of Honor. The film is based on Sergei, the youngest Soviet soldier during the Second World War. The youngest soldier, Soviet child Sergei Aleshkov. In 1942, Sergei was picked up by the army. He began his career as a soldier until the end of the war. He died in 1990, but his legacy lives on. There's a line of dialogue in the film that really stuck with me. The commander says, "Children don't belong on the battlefield." The nurse replies that no one belongs here, because every soldier is a child of his parents. Well, that's all for today. See you next time.